Today we are going to start a new 4-week series leading up to Christmas, and what we're going to be looking at is a series called Regifting Christmas. And those of you, how many of you have re-gift something before? Okay, you have. Usually when you re-gift something, you take something you don't really like and something you weren't going to use and you re-gift it and give it to someone else because you just want to get it out of your house. We as a small group have a tradition over the years that we have several things like that we just keep re-gifting to each other every year, all right? And many of you probably have similar stories. But what we're going to be looking at is this, a unique case. A case where you take a gift that has changed your life and take it and something that has already changed you and re-gift it, repackage it, put it in a nice little box with a bow, and take it to a world and give it to them. And share with them the meaning and the true meaning of Christmas. And that's what we're going to be looking at for the next 4 weeks, is how we re-gift the meaning of Christmas. You see, we are living in a world right now where every year it gets harder and harder to actually find the real meaning of Christmas in our society. One, because of the commercialization of it, that everything's become about just buying stuff and giving stuff. The other side of it is we're living in a more and more secular society that honestly just wants to mute it. They don't want people to necessarily know the real meaning of Christmas. So a lot of people know more about the gifts they're going to get this Christmas than they actually do the real reason why we celebrate the holiday in the first place. For instance, I bet that you'll remember all these Christmas gifts from the past. These are the top sellers over some of the years from the past, and I bet you remember all of them. Let me put these up on here. 1936, that's when this one, Monopoly, came out in 1936. It was the number one Christmas item that children wanted. Does anybody in here remember being a child the first year it came out in the craze for Monopoly? Yeah, not you, Elijah. You're not that old. I know we have a couple 90-year-olds that just turned 90 in the last month, so they might have remembered this because they would have been 11 back then. And Monopoly when it came out. 1943, the Slinky came out. And if you had the Slinky, how many of you owned a Slinky? I had the Slinky, and we had the stairs in our house, or you put it on there, but I could never get to go more like 4 stairs, so I could never get to work right. But the Slinky was the number one toy in 1943. 1952, Mr. Potato Head came out, and he was the number one toy that kids wanted that year. 1975 was the Pet Rock. Now, I got to ask this real quick. Did anyone in here actually have a Pet Rock or buy one for a kid, one of their children? Christy, what was it? I was so disturbed. I saw it and I was like, that was the year I was born. Thank God my generation came into the world to save us from gifts like that ever again. So 1975, the Pet Rock was the craze that people were waiting in line to go get, was a Pet Rock, all right? Here we go, next slide. Here's some others. 1980, the Rubik's Cube. That was the number one gift everybody wanted in 1980. 1983 was Cabbage Patch Dolls. I remember that craze. That was one of the bigger crazes where, I don't know if it was like in Oklahoma, but in Michigan, it was like you couldn't find them and people were sending out Toys R Us for days at a time trying to find a Cabbage Patch doll. I think in 84 is when I finally got mine. So I got my Cabbage Patch doll in 84. Thank you, Mother. That was a special gift that year. It was my little football player Cabbage Patch doll. Don't judge me, all right? 1989 was the Game Boy. It was the first personal, digital, game system. That was a huge deal people wanted to get. 1995 was Beanie Babies. Remember those things? How many of you owned over 25 Beanie Babies? There you go. Okay. So Beanie Babies were the craze in 1995. Last slide here. 1996. I remember this one too. Tickle Me Elmo. Remember the brutal beatdowns of people and all for Tickle Me Elmo? So that was 1996 was Elmo. 1998, I never understood this one, but it was Furby. How many of you guys had Furby? Okay, so Furby. Wasn't that the thing that the eyes blinked and they're like, okay. So I don't know, that was the craze of 98. 2005 was the Xbox 360. It was the first newer game system to come out with the high-end graphics. That was all the craze in 2005. 2010, this is odd. Remember, this is only 5 years ago. The craze was the Nook. And that was where you could read books. You could download books, and it was black and white. 2010, that was still a hot item. And you look just 5 years later and you go, I would never read something on the black and white Nook anymore. And if you still have it, I apologize. But now you have tablets and all that are full colored and HD and everything else. But in 2010, just 5 years ago, the Nook was the big thing to have at Christmas. I actually bought it for my wife, and it was like the best gift I thought I ever could buy because it never stopped giving. Like, I could just order books, and she could have new books every year, and I wouldn't have to go buy them anymore. I just digitally download them. So as a husband, I was like, this is the best of every world that there could be. I don't even have to leave anymore to buy her presents. I can just get her books online, and I don't have to go to the stores anymore guessing what she wants. It's wonderful, I just have to say. So anyways, here's the deal. I don't want you leaving today just remembering the gifts of the past. That's not what I want you to remember. I want you to leave here today remembering God's gift of redemption to mankind. That's what I want you to know. It is one of the central themes to the Christian faith, and our society today desperately needs to know this story of redemption that is told in the scriptures and told through the life of Jesus Christ. As a society, as we fall further and further away from God's standards for how to live our lives, what we're also seeing is that the people of this society are suffering more and more of the consequences that come from not living by the way God would desire them to live. We see in our society right now all over the place that remorse is on the rise, that regret is on the rise, that hopelessness is on the rise, that a feeling of a distance from God is on the rise in our society. Anxiety is on the rise. Depression is on the rise. Guilt is on the rise. And just a simple loss of self-worth is starting to permeate every part of our society as people just go, I have no value, I have no worth anymore. And all these things I want you to understand are symptoms of sin. When it runs unchecked in your life, these are the consequences you will have when sin runs amok in your life. And when you have no way of reconciliation with that sin, when you have no way of dealing with that sin in your life, that whether you are a Christian or not, you know it's sin in your life. When you have no way to deal with that, what it does is it leads you to a very dark place in your life that keeps getting darker and darker. And you continue to live in a place that seems to constantly become a darker and less joyous place in your life. But we, as followers of Jesus Christ, we have the gift that the world needs to hear. We have the gift and we have the knowledge of the story of redemption. And redemption is the remedy to the consequences and the symptoms of sin in people's lives. So this morning, what I want to do is I want to remind you of the story of redemption that is told throughout the scriptures, that is told in the life of Jesus, and that Jesus actually tells us himself through a story. And I want you to take it, I want to re-gift it to the world that's around us and share it with them, because there's so many people that desperately need to hear the story of redemption. So we're going to look, if you have your Bibles or you can read on the screen, Luke chapter 15. There's a story told by Jesus in Luke 15. You might know it if you know your Bibles and you've been in church for a while as a prodigal son. But it is the perfect story of redemption that describes our walking away and our aloneness on our own and coming back to God and how God restores us. And I want to share that message with you this morning. So here's what it says starting in verse 11 of chapter 15 of the book of Luke. It says, Jesus told them this story. He says, a man had two sons. The younger son told his father, I want my share of the estate now before you die. So his father agreed to divide his wealth between his sons. So the first thing we see in the story is there's two sons. One of them just says this, Dad, I don't want to wait for you to die to get your money. I want it now so I can go do what I want to do. So would you just divide up your inheritance now and give it to me? Now, if you're a parent here, how many of you want to hear that message from your kid? Hey, Dad and Mom, you know what? Kind of struggling a little bit. I'm going to enjoy life. So would you just give me the money now that you would give me when you're dead and just give me half of it now? And then you just figure out a way to live the rest of your life on what you have left. But I would like my inheritance now so I can go off. Now, Mom, I've told you this several times. I say it in jest, not real. All right? Well, there might be a tinge of truth in it. But anyways, that's what this son says. He says, Father, I want my inheritance so I can just go do my own thing. I want it now before you die. I don't want to wait for you to be dead. And in this story, what you have to understand is this. We are that son. We are that son. The Father is God. We are that son. Or if you're not that son right now, you have been at some stage in your life, which is you have said this, God, I desire not to live the way you want me to live anymore. I don't want to do things the way you want me to do. And I want you to just give me freedom of my life so I can go do what I want to do. And that's what I desire. So would you just give me freedom and would you bless me as I go off and do my thing? And the interesting thing with how the story starts off is this. The father doesn't say, no, it's not going to happen. The father actually says, okay, I'll let you do that. And I want you to know this. If you choose to live apart from God, God doesn't force you and say, no, you're going to live with me. God says you can go. If you want to go do your own thing, you can go do your own thing. I wish you wouldn't. I'm your father. I love you, and I wish you wouldn't. And I know what's going to come, but I wish you wouldn't. But if you demand it, I'm going to let you have your free will. You get to do what you want to do, and God grants us freedom. It goes on in verse 13. It says, a few days later, this younger son packed up all of his belongings, and he moved to a distant land, and there he wasted all of his money in wild living. And what we see here is a transition. No longer is it his wish to kind of live apart from his father. At this point, he actually takes action. So it wasn't just, say, I want my inheritance, and I'm thinking about leaving. Now what we see is this young man goes, I'm leaving. And this is where I said we're that son, is we've all done this at some point in our lives where we went, I know, God, you love me. If you grew up in the church, maybe I've lived the way you want, but I want to go try things out on my own without you. And I'm going to take off and I'm going to do it. There's others of you that didn't grow up in the church and you never even knew your father, and you're just going, I'm going to go live the way I want to anyways. And you still don't know he really exists and that he loves you and he's out there. And we'll get to that part of the story shortly. But we are that son where it goes from not just a desire, it turns into action. We finally just go, God, I'm out of here. I'm going to go do my own thing. And it says they go off and he lives and he wastes all of his money on wild living. In verse 14 it says this, about the time his money ran out, a great famine swept over the land and he began to starve. And here's what we all eventually figure out when we go off and launch our lives on our own without God is this. Unexpected things happen. Do they not? You have plans in your head of how this is going to be wonderful and all, and then the unexpected happens, things you never saw that could happen, they happen, and you go, oh, that didn't turn out the way I thought. The other thing that happens is this. A lot of decisions that we think are great and wonderful and are going to serve us real well, we actually go and accomplish them, and then we found out afterwards, oh, that didn't turn out as good as I thought it was going to turn out. That turned out a lot less good than I thought. And my decision wasn't the greatest thing, and I'm suffering consequences now that I never thought I would. And that's what we find out, just like this young man, is when we choose to live outside of God's desires, when we choose to live apart from God, unexpected things happen, our decisions are not as good as we think they are, and we end up in dark places. We end up with a lot of these things I talked about earlier, regrets, anxieties, depression, caused by these sinful actions that we took outside of God's desire for our lives. And then it goes on in verse 15 and 16. It says this, he persuaded a local farmer, so he's starving. It says, he persuaded a local farmer to hire him, and this man sent him into the fields to feed the pigs. Let me stop you for a quick second. This isn't just like you going to feed pigs. This guy, we assume in the story, it's not a real story, he's telling a story, but he's talking to Jews. The worst thing you could possibly do, the worst job you could have as a Jew is work with pigs, because they were seen as unclean animals, the most unclean animals, because they waddle in mud and everything else. They were unclean animals. So the worst job you could ever have, the lowest position you could ever hold, isn't being a servant somewhere or even a slave. It's you work with pigs. Okay? So it says this guy has gone to the point where it says he persuaded a local farmer. So he had to convince this guy to hire him. The man sent him into the fields to feed the pigs. The young man became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding the pigs looked good to him, but no one gave him anything. Here's the other interesting thing at the end. He's working with pigs, already in a low position. Starts looking at the food he's giving to pigs and going, you know what? That actually looks pretty good too, because I'm so hungry I would even eat their food. Instead of giving it to the pigs, I'd rather just eat it. And then it says at the end, this is just a little throw-in, and nobody would help him. And what he finds out is this. When he had all this money, do you think people would help him? Yeah. The world loves you when you can offer it something. The minute you can't offer it anymore, the world just drops you. And it leaves you, and you're gone. And you can go beg them, and they all just turn their backs on you. That's what the world does. That's just the history of the world. That's humanity. That's what happens. And he experiences this. And what I would say here is this is a guy who hit rock bottom. This is rock bottom in your life. This is where the guy's feeding pigs, desiring the food he's feeding them. No one's there to help him, and he's on his own in a horrible situation, and he's hit rock bottom. Now, how many of you have experienced this point in your life where you can say you hit rock bottom? How many of you have been there that you hit rock bottom? Okay? It's different for all of us, and it can be in different ways. Some of you go, well, I know people that had it worse, but you hit your rock bottom. I remember when I was 20 years old. It was my freshman year in college, in February of my freshman year, and it was after a weekend of partying with some friends over at Michigan State University. and came back, and I woke up that Saturday morning, and I remember it was the first time in my life where I went, dude, this stinks. My life stinks. I've been doing the same thing for like 5 years, and this stinks. And I remember asking this question going, there has to be something more to life. There has to be something more in this, because this is miserable. And I remember waking up that morning going, I've got to see if there's something is. And that's where I really began my journey of searching out God at that point. Now, that was my rock bottom. Now, was my rock bottom like some of yours? No. I'm sure there's others of you had stories. You'd be like, you got to hear mine. I'd be like, yeah, that wasn't mine. But to me, that's where I fell in the same place that guy was, which is where I'm at is miserable. And this is just rock bottom. There's no place to go but up, and I'm hoping there's an up to get to. And I remember being at that place. And what we see is this, and this is what you need to understand. If you hear nothing else today about redemption, you need to understand this about what sin does in your life. Sin always promises more than it gives. If you have followed sin in your life, you know that sin always promises you things are going to be great if you just indulge in this. It's going to be wonderful if you get involved in this. Sin always takes you further than you wanted to go. Sin always gets you in with something little, and then it keeps taking you step and step and step further than you ever wanted to go. And before you know it, you're already down here, and you're going, how the heck did I end up here? It's what sin does. And sin leaves you off worse than you were before. You will find this truth out in life. When you sin in your life, where you end up after sinning is always worse than where you started. You always end up feeling worse about things. You always end up feeling, going, man, why did I get in that? And you just feel like you're dirty. You just feel like it's on you. Sin always leaves you in a worse place than you were before. Sin promises you freedom from God. Sin promises you to live your own life. You don't have to live under the restraints of God. But what you always find out is that sin always brings you to a place of slavery, where it literally controls your life and it steals your humanity. That's what sin does in your life, and that's what this guy finds out. In verse 17, it carries on. It says this, when he finally came to his senses, so he starts to wake up in this desperation, and he says to himself, at home, even the hired servants have food enough to spare, and here I am dying of hunger. What you see at this point is this. This guy, for the first time, starts to wake up to his own actions and himself. He doesn't wake up to anyone else yet. He's on his own. But internally, he starts to wake up, and he starts to look back at the life he could have had and goes, you know what? Even the worst life that I lived back here before I went on my own was a whole lot better than it is now that I've been on my own, sinning, doing what I wanted to do, and the consequences I've now received in my life. This was so much better, even in a worse spot than where it is now today. And you get a guy who, for the first time, kind of starts to wake up, and he starts to think this, I think. My dad might not have been as dumb as I thought he was. My dad might have actually had some wisdom behind why he was asking me to live certain ways and do certain things in my life. My dad might have actually been a smart guy and actually cared for me more than I thought he did and was trying to protect me of things that I didn't think he really was. I thought he was trying to keep me controlled and contained, and realized, no, my father is actually trying to protect me from all the damage that could be done when I go off on my own and do my own thing. And you see this guy wake up for the first time realizing this. He says in verse 18, it says this, he makes a decision. He says, I will go home to my father. Now let me stop for a second. This is big. This is tough. This is something a lot of people can't bring themselves to do. This guy, he's already asked his father for his inheritance before he dies. Give it to me. His father gives it to him. He then tells his dad, I don't want to live with you anymore, and I'm going to go do what I want to do, and he walks out on his dad and leaves. At this point in his life, he realizes, you know what? I'm going to turn around and go back to my father. A lot of us spiritually, we get to this place where we realize we've hit rock bottom. We realize God's the answer. But to turn around and start taking those steps to get back to him, something that's just hard for us to do. Because we look at it and we go, I've already done this to God. I've already said these things. I've made these decisions. There is not a chance in the world he's going to take me back. And sin, again, makes us a slave and goes, you can't have free will to go do what you know you ought to do. You need to stay where you're at. You need to stay put. This guy at least wakes up enough in the story, and he says, I'll go home to my father, and I will say this, Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son. Please take me on as a hired hand. So what we see is he decides to go home, but he also decides to tell his dad, you know what, Dad, I understand everything I did horrible to you, and I know I can't be your son anymore, and I don't deserve it. Just let me be a hired hand. I'll be happy to be a hired hand in your house. And this is a strange development because in a very short time, what you see is you see a guy that went from being very proud, even to the point of egotistical and arrogant. He is now a guy who is broken and humbled in a very short time. He goes from this guy, I can do everything on my own, I just want my money and I can live it my way and it's going to be better than you give to me. And then in a very short time, he's going, I need to go home and Dad, I've messed it all up and I'll just be a hired servant. And this is the ultimate result of sin in your life as we see this. Sin steals your self-worth. As he looked back at his father and he knew going back, because this is what sin was telling him, I can't be a son anymore. But maybe he'll accept me as one of his servants or one of his slaves, and I can at least live in that condition still around him. But I can't be his son anymore because of all the things I've done. There's no way he's going to accept that. So I know what I've done. I'm okay with that. I'd rather just be a servant there than in the lonely place I'm in. And it gets to this in verse 20. He says, so he returned home to his father. And while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming. Filled with joy, love and compassion, he ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. So if you've never heard this story before, you go, oh, I wasn't expecting that. If you've heard the story before, you go, oh, I knew that was coming. But the first time you heard this is not the expectation you had in the story. Is he starts to head home, and instead of even the father coming out and looking at him and going, here he comes, how am I going to deal with this? And this is, parents, we've all been here. When a kid turns around and comes back to you, and you're just sitting there scratching your head going, do I whoop him? Or am I nice to him and then whoop him? Or do I whoop him like 6 times and then I do the nice thing? Or do I do the nice thing twice and then beat him 4 times? You know how that works as a parent, right? You have all those emotions. This parent, who's representative of God, sees his son, it says, from a long distance off, which I would assume is before the son saw him, and he runs to him and embraces him. He runs to the son and wraps his arm around him, and he embraces his son, and he kisses him. And you can just see this dad just hugging on him and crying and going, I'm so glad you're home. And here's what we learn is this. God's actions when it comes to restoration in our lives always are amazing and unexpected. The way God responds to us when we turn back to him are never the way we expect him to, and they're always things that are outside the box that we would just go, why would he treat us that way? But yet God does. And that's what we see in this story. In verse 15 or in verse 22, it says this, wrapping the story up. It says, his father said to his servants, quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Get a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet. The ring for his finger symbolized that he was his son. It was getting his son's ring back, that he's his son, which obviously means the son, when he left, took it off and went, I'm no longer your son, and threw it on the floor or something. He says, quick, get the ring, put it on his finger, get his sandals for his feet. He's not going to walk around like a servant without sandals. And kill the calf that we have been fattening. We must celebrate with a feast. For the son of mine was dead, and now he has returned to life. He was lost, but now he is found. So the party began. All right? This is a story of redemption. After all that we have done, God chooses to see us as flawless, and God chooses to see us as his children in spite of everything we've done. He takes us from a place of destitution, where we have nothing and we have nothing to offer him, and he places us in a place of restoration where we are again his children, just like we were before we ever left. That is the story of redemption. Many of you sitting here right now have probably already experienced that gift of redemption in your life. Now you have the opportunity, and you also have the privilege to re-gift that to someone else during this Christmas season who really needs to hear that story. So this morning to close, what we're going to do a little bit different. We're going to watch a music video, and it's by a group named Mercy Me. You might have heard the song already, and the song is Flawless. And their video does a really good job, I think, of reminding us of the story of redemption. So we're just going to watch it, and then I'm going to wrap things up here in a second. So Molly, you want to start that video?